Well, friends, we are going to get underway. Welcome to the Love in a Big World webinar for the month of September with Dr. Tony Majors. I am thrilled to have him as a guest. We're going to be talking about the new world of school. And for those of you who are just joining, if you would please add your name and your organization and your role in that organization in the chat, that will help us make sure that we're addressing your needs. You can also feel free during our conversation today to type in your questions, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end of our conversation. So, Dr. Majors, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. Very glad to be here.
As we get underway, would you please share a little bit more about who you are and your background and what brings us to this conversation today?
My name is Tony Majors, Dr. Tony Majors. I live outside of Nashville, so in the greater Middle Tennessee region. I'm a 27-year veteran of public education, and I've served from capacity of a teacher and coach to assistant principal, principal to assistant superintendent. And I've been fortunate enough to have experience in a cross number of sectors in public education, from school leadership and instruction to the student services realm to human resources and some of the wraparound services.
So you've done everything.
I haven't done everything, but I've been involved in a lot of things.
Yes. Well, I am excited to have your well-rounded perspective. And just so you know, Dr. Majors, we have friends joining us from here in Nashville, as well as Wilmington, Delaware. Jody's from Wilmington. Naomi is from Upland Unified School District. Margaret from Toronto. Brescia, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, from the YMCA of Middle Tennessee, the YCAP program. So friends, we're glad you're here. And Lysette is here. Hi, Lysette. We're doing some work together. She's from San Francisco. We've got friends from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So we have a wide audience here to hear your words of wisdom. So today we're talking about the new world of school. And Dr. Majors, I would love for you to share with us your perspective, given all the years of experience and the diverse roles that you've had in education. How do you see education systems responding to the changing needs of students, especially during this time of COVID, as well as civil unrest?
Well, I do think all school systems are really doing the best they can at this time, particularly in the COVID response. With COVID, there are so many changing dynamics. So there's no concrete or, ironclad response right now. I think most school systems are doing the best they can in terms of putting in safety protocols, of trying to work with their communities, their teachers, their families, as well as community leaders to ensure, first of all, safety for their employees and for the students, but also looking at, what's going to be the next phase. We anticipate, or I would anticipate, that with COVID, we're going into flu season when many schools are starting to open back up. That'll bring another, dynamic of stress and the desire for more school-based sanitation. So I think putting the safety protocols in place is critical. I think it's the right first step. I think most school systems are doing a really good job of trying to communicate where they are and where they're going with their constituents. I think that's going to be critical. If families are left in the dark, that just leads to more anxiety. And if teachers are left in the dark, it leads to even more anxiety. They want to know exactly what's coming and what the expectations are of them. When it comes to social unrest, I think school systems are observing to some degree, because I think the needs of kids and, I think that's going to be very different depending on where the school systems are, the communities where they are. But I think school systems are probably making preparations for when you're faced with, a challenging conversation, or there's another community-based event that leads to more social unrest. Here are some scripts, here are some ideas to help you guide that conversation. So for the most part, I think school systems are very much in the planning process. I think they are probably looking ahead to some degree, but I don't think there will be one perfect answer to either of these responses. I think it'll be a work in progress.
And I feel like we were all caught off guard back in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've had 6 months of planning and preparation. I'm sure you've talked to a lot of people all over the country, as I have, and people there's a continuum of response, and some are more optimistic or more progressive with their planning. And then I think there's others who are much more reticent, particularly to put kids back in the school buildings. But you mentioned communication. So what do you see are the best ways or the best messages that school leaders can provide to students, parents, and teachers to let them know that safety is that priority?
Well, I think the most important thing is to make sure you're using communication in multiple modalities, multiple forms. Constantly communicating to your constituents, this is our plan. These are the things that have been done. These are the things that will be done on a day-to-day basis. These are some of the ongoing preventive measures that we will have in place. I know some of the things, some of the major responses that I've seen are, in addition to daily wipe down and mask and those types of responses. Some schools have implemented ultraviolet lighting to kill bacteria. Some schools are using electrostatic uh, sanitation processes that stick to surfaces and kill bacteria for a longer period of time. Parents and community members want to know those things because those are the preventive measures they want to see in place. I also think it's really important to begin to communicate with parents around when people don't follow the safety protocols. This is our progressive plan. This is how we're going to address those types of things. Or if a student comes in with a fever or is believed to be sick, this is our immediate response plan. The more that people know, the less anxiety they have around the issue. I also think it's really critical that in addition to communicating just to your primary stakeholders, you're communicating to a broader audience in your community because you want there to be confidence around public education. We know that in different states, you have different school systems and, or different types of schools in the same city. Some are in schools, some are not. So people are wondering what's the difference between the two. So ongoing constant communication, transparency around what you're doing, and then communicating throughout the process. And since we know that, there's going to be a risk that there could be another shutdown, we just don't know at this point in time. Communicating to families, these are the factors that will be considered, when we look at making changes to school schedules or potential shutdowns, long-term or short-term. That way people can begin to prepare as best as possible.
And I so appreciate what you're saying because as a citizen, I feel much, and as a mom, I feel much more confident about the safety of my children when I know that there's a plan. Like you said, this is past, present, and future action. I'm being transparent and open. That lets me know that my kids are being taken care of. And I've got kids in higher ed as well as 2 in high school. So one of the biggest challenges that I've had as a parent, not just as an educator, but as a parent, has been the lack of transparency and then feeling like my kids are the ones who are at risk, so I agree. All of that communication and transparency is key. So what do you see? I know we talked before, and I'm going to skip around from where I was originally going to go. Given these situations that we find ourselves in with COVID, with our social situations, where do you think education is headed, Dr. Majors?
That's a really broad question, Tamara. I think one of the things that has really got my attention is that with COVID, we have seen the integration, nationally of online learning. So now that online learning platform has now reached and is being practiced by communities and students who traditionally would have never even considered it. So we've exposed, entire communities of learners to a new learning modality. What I think that may create is the desire and interest in more choice and innovative programs in the K-12 space. You and I were having a conversation earlier about, your college age children, or high school student being in an online learning environment, and now that's changing their perception of where they want to go to college. Well, I believe that reality is going to impact a large number of kids. I think there has been some discussion in different spaces around, what percentage of kids may never return to the traditional learning environment. And that's on both ends of the spectrum. A percentage of high achieving kids may choose to remain in an online learning environment and never returned to a K-12 space, traditional K-12 space. But how many of our at-risk students who have been behind academically for multiple years, who have now not had that direct instruction, and our children who may have poor internet connectivity, not have the access to the devices, or not have the access to academic support at home, who are falling further behind, who now may disengage in the educational process. And we haven't even begun to talk about our students with chronic health conditions that may not be able to return to a traditional learning space for an extended period of time. So when you talk about just those three populations of students, the desire for more innovative and non-traditional educational models, I think, may come out of the COVID response. So I think the changing landscape could be more online, more non-traditional, more choice options, but also the integration of more community-based educational support structures, because I think that's going to be critical so that students do have access to expertise and support when they're struggling, and also the demand for more work-based or workforce development, as well as skill-based instruction. So just a few thoughts.
So my mind is racing, and
Oh.
I love conversations with you because philosophically there's a lot of alignment between the ways that we think because of the innovation that we embrace. So I have a few questions about what you just said. Given the fact that the landscape is changing and will continue to change, given these special populations that you identified, what do you see is going to happen for these students? Do you think that we're going to see a greater disparity between the haves and the have-nots? Do you think that innovation will help bridge that gap? And that we can better meet kids where they are rather than just trying to fit them within a mold of education looks like this? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think the answer is probably going to be D, a little bit of all of the above. And I do want to quantify this as saying, I don't believe there is an expert in this space anywhere. I think we're all just sort of providing our own personal insight based on our own experiences and things that we've learned. So nothing that I'm saying is, definitive. But my opinion is, I think the risk of potential increased disparity is real. I think that's my greatest fear, because we knew the disparities existed based on race and socioeconomic status for years in public education. So we know that the disparity is real. With COVID and now the integration of technology, the disparity has the potential to widen to even a larger percentage of students. So preventive measures are going to be necessary. And I do think that's where innovation becomes a part of the conversation. I do think that we have to pay more attention to our at-risk populations, our kids that begin to disengage. They could begin to disengage earlier because some students are not in the traditional learning environment. That ongoing monitoring and assessment, means that our kids could be falling further and further behind at a higher pace or a higher rate of speed, which means it's going to take much more work to move them forward to get them back to proficiency and obtaining academic success. So that is a fear. You mentioned a couple other things.
I know, there's a lot. So I'm thinking as you're talking, when it comes to innovation, I have the privilege this semester of mentoring 2 interns from Big Picture. And if you're not familiar with the Big Picture model, I encourage you to look at it. It's really a worldwide model of education that for high schoolers that provides 3 days of classroom instruction and 2 days of internships. And Dr. I keep thinking that's the way to go. What are your thoughts about how we can bridge that gap and not only take care of the needs of kids who may be at risk, but also help promote and provide opportunities for them in a new way of looking at education?
Well, I actually really, I'm a huge supporter of the big picture model. I agree. I think it is one of the better educational models for high school age students. I don't think it's applicable for all because there has to be a significant amount of community and business support to do that. I happen to agree with you. I think the intersection between education, workforce development, post-secondary opportunities is going to be critical in the future, for the future of education, but also for the future for workforce development. I think as we train our students, and my former school district, we were huge supporters of the career academy model, small learning communities, to make learning relevant, relevancy based on the student's career interests and aptitudes. Well, if we're introducing students to career interest and aptitude in 8th and 9th grade, we need to make sure we're integrating some of the skill development for those students during the high school experience. I do think that's a space where innovation is going to become a significant component of education in the future, because the workforce development component connected to the academic pursuits is going to be, it could be the carrot that helps a student stay engaged in the educational process, but also pushes them to expand their learning, to enter into new fields, to explore new opportunities, but keeping them engaged in the learning process and the educational process, I just think is critical.
So with all of these changes and innovations that are happening, and the different ways that we have kids learning right now, between being in school, a hybrid model of in school and virtual, or just virtual, how can we best address their social and emotional needs? I know that you've spent a lot of your career dedicated to student services. So in this changing world, how can we make sure that our kids are being taken care of?
Well, I want to go back to the previous question. You just triggered something I wanted to make sure I said, and then I'll come back to the SEL question, Tamara, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When I talked about that, there needs to be a significant amount of community engagement and support for that workforce development big picture model. That's also another new opportunity. You have community colleges, traditional four-year post-secondary institutions, but you have industry in all communities who desire to have a better prepared workforce, of the future. It's difficult for industries to take students under the age of 18 into a corporate environment. Working with educational institutions to eliminate the barriers for that internship opportunity, that job shadowing opportunity, the mentorship opportunities will be critical, but that comes through partnership. And those dialogues take a while. There are a lot of logistics to work through. So I think that's just another opportunity of where the community engagement component of public education can change and grow, a new opportunity within the innovative space. But to your question around SEL, what we can do for our kids, I think social emotional learning has become, for some of us that were early adopters, SEL was the foundation and needs to be the foundation for everything in a K-12 space. I sincerely believe that, because if you don't have supportive, nurturing learning environments, you're going to always have students that struggle. And SEL now with COVID is even more important, because then we need to be even more attentive to the social emotional learning needs of our educators, of our staffs and our employees. And we're no longer just talking about the needs of just our kids. We have to make sure we're addressing the needs and concerns of parents, grandparents, non-custodial caregivers. There are all these different populations who are worried about returning to the traditional learning space. So some things that we need to do with our kids. One, make sure that we're very clear on these are the things that we're doing. Let's take care of your physical safety first, okay? Mm-hmm. Once we've moved past physical safety, let's make sure we have the systems in place to address the students who are exhibiting signs of trauma, signs of stress, that are really having difficulties, not just students, but also for our teachers. Building in breaks so students can decompress, providing a space for students and teachers to express how they feel. That's both for COVID, but also regarding some of the social justice issues that we're dealing with. How to form constructive conversation, how to allow students to express and staff to express their feelings openly, create the conduit for those conversations. One thing I will say for our students is teaching them some of the core SEL standards and practices of how to, be aware of how you feel, then how do you respond appropriately? And for teachers, I really think it's going to elevate the need for more mindfulness. being mindful of how you feel, being mindful of your own bias or how you're responding to kids or how you're responding to a circumstance within your classroom. What we don't want to do is have an adult response that disengages more youth or exacerbates the problem. So self-awareness becomes critical. You have to be aware of how your responses are impacting others. And then once you have those systems in place, the one thing I think we have to do is we can't ask teachers to do all things in an educational setting. Our teachers can't be the academic experts and the instructional professionals and the social worker and the clinician. They just can't do everything. They need to be trained. They need to be able to make that immediate response. But then you need to have access to the professionals. We need to have access to social workers, behavior specialists, psychologists, mental health and behavioral health professionals, as well as healthcare professionals to then provide that one-on-one or group response to those students who need the additional support and create the space. I think that's going to be one of the big shifts we see in the K-12 space. So much of our time was dominated by testing. Testing. We have to get the kids to this space academically. We can't take them out of English class because there was a major catastrophe in their home last night. Well, I think now we're going to have to free up some of that space. We're going to free up space during the traditional school day for students to receive the additional services that they need.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more, Dr. Majors. As you're talking, I'm thinking about the educators that I'm in contact with on a regular basis. And the number one thing that they're telling me is that they're overwhelmed and they're stressed. Mm-hmm. And that they're working, even though they're not in the building, they're telling me we're working harder than we've ever worked before to meet our kids online. So what are some, you mentioned breaks, but what's it going to take for us to understand how important it is to, first of all, treat our teachers as humans and give them the space that they need, but then also, like you said, give our students breaks too, and really regard their humanity as well, and just come to some sort of balance with the workload, especially while everybody's still learning this new way?
Well, I think there are a lot of different ways to accomplish that. I also think that's going to very much depend on individual school and district leadership. At the end of the day, what impacts teachers the most is what happens within the leadership structures of their individual school. Mm-hmm. But I also think I think as adults, we recognize that when you give me a break to refresh, when you let me step away, my productivity increases when I return. I think the same can be said for our children. We have to give them an opportunity just to step away for a moment. And I hear the same thing, that our teachers are extremely stressed, worried, trying to manage, worried about the kids that aren't logging in, how to communicate, making connections. And I understand that. I think there'll need to be a trickle down effect. I think you will need district leaderships to really prioritize a commitment to mindfulness, a commitment to really paying attention to the emotional state of our educational clients, whether it be teachers, staff, or students. And I also think that needs to trickle down with some clear directives, and I hate to use the word directives. I can't believe I used it. Trickle down in a way that you're saying, school leaders, it's important for you to build in these opportunities for staff to refresh. These are resources. These are some techniques. And in school districts that have mental health and behavioral health professionals, they already have access to information that can be shared. So really equipping teachers with the tools, but prioritizing the need to institutionalize some of those techniques that just allow us to relax just for a moment, mm-hmm. refresh, collect ourselves, and then get back to the issue at hand. Now, I also think there's a little bit of a give and take. Mm-hmm. Education is driven by outcomes. So we still have to move the needle academically. So you can't say, okay, we're going to completely shift to only focus on the emotional health and not really focus on our academics. There's a space where you can do both, and you can do both effectively. The answer to how to take things off the plate of teachers, I again think that's almost individual, school by school, district by district, where you have to look at what are the things that we're asking of our professionals and what are the things that can be put on hold, can be taken back. One thing I think is critical is that when teachers have planning time or, duty-free lunch periods, they need to be able to utilize that time for self
Mhm.
and individual growth as much as possible. We all know there are always going to be times when a planning period's needed for a team meeting or an IEP meeting or something like that. Those are some things that come with the job. But protecting that time as much as possible will be critical for our teachers just to refresh and relax long enough to be prepared for their next group of students.
Mhm. That's good. That's good. And friends, if you have questions for Dr. Majors, please feel free to add those in the chat at this time. And as those pop up, I'll share those with him. Um, some of the things I'm thinking about in what you're saying, this space that we find ourselves in right now reminds me of the early days of a startup. The entrepreneurs are just running and trying to figure out the new thing and all the work and that's pretty much where we are as an educational system. It's like startup phase, figuring out this new world of online learning. It's not sustainable though. It's to go at this pace and as you're saying, to keep these requirements of the teachers and of the students while at the same time expecting learning to occur and having deliverables. So one of the things that I'm really intrigued by is the relationship between synchronous and asynchronous learning.
Mhm.
And what I've seen is that requires a certain amount of relinquishment of control. So how can we help educators release control, and how can we encourage students to take control of their own learning?
Well, unfortunately, I think that's been one of the challenges of public education for several years, even prior to the online learning. Some students are going to be self-motivated. Some students are going to take control of their learning, and some students are going to always need much more of a nudge, more hand-holding and more support. But the same can be said for teachers. Some teachers are early adopters of, you know, pick one, project-based learning, skills-based, assessment, the things that provide, portfolio assessments.
Mhm.
There are people who are early adopters of new, educational models, and there are those who believe that no, I've got to have X number of assignments. We've got to have this type of a scripted lesson. That's a personal preference. I do think providing more professional development to our teachers on ways to change their instructional practices would be critical, and showing the benefit. Don't just say, do this because we said do this. By integrating this type of learn assessment model or this type of teaching strategy, it allows you to have more time to do it X, Y, or Z. So begin to show some of the benefits. It's that again will be, I think, one of the spaces where we begin to see more shifts. It almost goes back to one of your earlier questions when you were talking about the fact that, okay, some students can take this instruction and go with very little assistance from their teacher and will
Mhm.
do perfectly fine. Those may be the children that desire to continue in a online learning platform only, then don't want to return to a traditional learning environment. The other part of that equation, however, and I think you're seeing more school districts do this, school districts are trying to determine what percentage of students may not return, what type of learning program are they most interested in, and what are the circumstances that are leading to their decision. What's informing their decision to either return or not return, or do they want a blended model, or whatever that looks like. The same thing has to happen for some of our teachers, because all the same factors that we talked about for our student population are applicable for our teaching force. We will have teachers that have chronic health conditions that don't feel comfortable returning to school. Does that mean they lose their job? We haven't had those conversations yet. Well, we know there's going to be a space where we're going to need more online instructors. Does that mean they work for their districts, or do they go and work for an outside agency that's providing online instruction in contract with school districts? We don't know right now, but those are all the conversations that have to take place, because we know that while many districts are now integrating technology and utilizing their teachers, to have your teacher teach a traditional course X number of periods a day, and then an online course, will that be too much for our teachers? Could be. So do we look for an outside service provider to provide the online services for us? It's all dynamics. It definitely is dependent upon funding. So those are things that still have to be answered. Those are still some of the questions that, school districts have to solve for.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Majors, I am so thankful that you've been able to spend some time, and there's so much more that we could talk about. I'm hopeful that we could get together again. Closing thoughts before we leave.
I think the closing thought for me is really around the fact that right now there are no definitive answers. We are very much in a startup. Having an entrepreneurial and innovative mindset in the K-12 space is going to be critical moving forward. I think what COVID has done is introduced a different choice option in the K-12 space. It's no longer around what school you go to or where you go to school. It's what type of educational program you're participating in. So I think that's going to be the new niche, the new opportunities in public education, innovation, new program development, new partnership opportunities. We touched a little bit on it with the workforce development component around big picture, but I do think there will be a need, particularly for historically underserved communities. Historically underserved communities have not had the consistent support that they need in the academic space. And despite, we have tidal infusion of capital, we have a lot of investment going into those communities, partnering with community-based agencies who are willing to get into this space, I do believe is going to be critical. And those partnerships will need to extend beyond workforce development opportunities. Within the communities where the students live, do you create the opportunities for, site-based tutoring labs and instructional support models? Do you create opportunities for recreational engagement with a local agency? Keeping our kids engaged and getting them back to a sense of normalcy, even if they're not in a traditional K-12 environment 8 hours a day, is going to be really important. It's equally important for our kids to learn academically as they grow socially and emotionally. We're going to have to be really intentional about creating those spaces for our young people. Innovation is going to be critical. Partnership is going to be critical, but I think both will look different than they have in the previous 8 to 10 years. We will need to be looking beyond our existing practices to new and innovative practices for engagement and growth opportunities for our teachers and for our students.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for sharing those wise words with us. And friends, we will make sure that you receive a link that you can pass along. Also, feel free to join us on our Facebook page where this full conversation has been posted and shared. And I'll follow up with you with an email. Thanks again for your time today, Dr. Majors. And
you're welcome. My pleasure.
For Love in a Big World. And we will see you next time. Make it a great day.
All right, you too.